Content warning. This presentation begins with a brief discussion on statistics of emotional, physical, and sexual violence against women and members of the LGBTQ+ community. If you feel you may be made uncomfortable or triggered by this content, we suggest you skip ahead to the 8-minute, 30-second mark.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia and Russ, and to FutureChurch generally for this invitation. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I've attended a few FutureChurch liturgies in the past, and I always find it such a life-giving experience. So again, I'm very grateful to be here. And I have a PowerPoint, so I'm gonna hope that everything is gonna go smoothly as I pull this up. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, so much. The title of my talk is Celebrating Queer Becoming, and I'm kind of playing a little bit with this language of becoming versus coming out, and I'll be using spirituality as sort of a guide throughout this presentation. Here's a brief outline of where I hope to take us this evening. So first, I want to think about this idea of the closet that really is kind of behind the idea of coming out, or why it is that LGBTQ or queer people need to come out in the first place. And a lot of that centering around kind of issues of power, oppression, and violence in various capacities. The research that I do is focused on queer students on Catholic university campuses. And so I'll begin looking a little bit at what the closet looks like on a Catholic university campus. But while I'm doing this, I definitely invite you to consider how the closet affects folks in your own community. So maybe that might be at a parish or in your family. I'll be focusing on the United States context, but maybe that context might look different for you, and even subcultures around the US can, of course, be different experiences. So I invite you to do your own reflection during that piece as well. In the second part, I'll sort of zoom out a little bit and think about or talk about how some queer theorists think about this idea of the closet on a more theoretical level. And so Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick will be my big conversation partner there. I'll walk us through some of what she is using to think about queer identity and what it means to be LGBTQ. And thirdly, we'll go from there into thinking about what all of this, thinking about identity, thinking about liberation and violence, what all of that might mean for us as Catholics with our unique anthropology of human dignity and the dignity we place on all individuals, but also what a sort of spiritual or contemplative sort of understanding of that anthropology might actually offer both queer people, but also the church generally. And then from there, I'll go into thinking a little bit more practically about incorporating all of these elements. What might personal reflection or LGBTQ ministry look like from a perspective of queer becoming? Okay, so as I'll begin by thinking about the closet on Catholic college campuses, I'll be beginning with some statistics and some overview from two major sources. Firstly, thinking about sex and gender from an angle of hookup culture and sexual assault. And I do want to begin with a content warning here. So please feel free throughout this portion or throughout the presentation generally to take care of yourself, go off video, drink water, etc. And after this piece on hookup culture, I'll be talking a bit about Catholic teaching on sex and gender and its place on the college campus. So the rise of hookup culture is believed to be associated with the rise in sexual assaults on college campuses. Megan McCabe is a Catholic ethicist whose work has been very influential and informative for me. She writes that rape on campus is not a deviant form of violence perpetrated by bad men. Rather, campus rape is the violent manifestation of seemingly normal heterosexuality. So this campus culture encourages hypermasculine, aggressive and dominant, and hyperfeminine, acquiescent and passive performances of gender. And this type of culture, patterns of sexuality that are infused with violence, coercion, and abuse are seen as typical, normal expressions of heterosexual relationality and encounters. And the dominant form of sexual encounters on college campuses, known as hookups, male partners are socialized to assume the availability of women's bodies and to filter sexual desire through objectification. Most studies of sexual assault on college campuses that track these cultural trends and gender expectations focus on straight female victims. And as a result, literature on the prevalence of sexual assault in the LGBTQ campus community and our understanding of how the hookup model of sexual intimacy affects queer students is pretty sparse. While knowledge on the topic is limited, research on the general population indicates equal or greater risk for sexual violence amongst LGBT people. And in a large and unique study of 21 colleges and universities, straight women and gay bisexual men reported similar rates of sexual assault at around 25% of the population. Bisexual women had the highest rates of any group, with 38% reporting an instance of sexual assault. Another study found that LGBT students are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than straight men, and transgender students are more likely to experience sexual assault than cisgender students. And the lack of percentages there is sort of a data issue. But ultimately, such high numbers for these sexual minority groups strongly suggest that there is a relationship between sexual orientation and sexual violence during individuals' formative years in college. And this point about sexual orientation, sexual violence in years of formation requires emphasis here. A 2013 study by the Pew Research Center showed that while most gay, lesbian, and bisexual people knew for sure that they were LGBTQ between the ages of 15 and 18, the first time they told someone else was between the ages of 18 and 21. So this means that college-educated LGBTQ people who matriculate to their institution directly after high school, on average, are coming out to people at their university and are engaging in discernment about queer sex for the first time on their college campuses. LGBTQ identity is therefore being forged in an environment of dominant cultural understandings of masculinity and femininity, where social rewards and incentives lie in the hooking up model. The data that is available shows that LGBTQ people and gender minorities experience disproportionately high rates of sexual violence on college campuses, a statistic located within the rigid sex and gender norms dictated by hookup culture. I will go on to this next piece here on Catholic teaching on sex and gender that is also prevalent in our various Catholic spaces. And instead of detailing the whole entire history of the social teaching tradition, I actually find that Fiducia Supplicans and Dignitas Infinita provide a really great kind of microcosm of the various developments within the tradition. So you might be familiar, in December 2023, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith published Fiducia Supplicans on the pastoral meaning of blessings. This document emphasizes a pastoral and living understanding of blessing, such that the church must shy away from resting its pastoral praxis on the fixed nature of certain doctrinal or disciplinary schemes. The prefect, Victor Manuel Cardinal Fernandez, with Pope Francis's approval, concludes that there appears the possibility for blessing same-sex couples. And this document received significant national and international media attention, given the Catholic Church's notorious position upholding gender complementarity in marriage. However, less than 4 months later, in April 2024, the DDF releases Dignitas Infinita on human dignity, And this document, which carries equal authority and approval from Fernandez, harshly condemns gender theory and sex change as contrary to Catholic understandings of human dignity. And the quote here, gender theory intends to deny the greatest possible difference that exists between living beings, sexual difference. This foundational difference is not only the greatest imaginable difference, but is also the most beautiful and most powerful of them. In the male-female couple, this difference achieves the most marvelous of reciprocities. So taken together, fiducia supplicans and dignitas infinita helpfully represent a Catholic Church at a critical juncture, attempting simultaneously to create pastoral spaces of welcome for queer people and to hold onto traditional views of sex and gender that undergird much of Catholic theology, institutional practices, and governance structures. This tension is not new, but rather is the result of shifts that have been occurring since the Second Vatican Council toward a modern enculturated church that embraces the social sciences and emphasizes personal conscience as an ethical resource. So it's in these ways that fiducia supplicans and dignitas infinita represent competing strains within Catholic social teaching. While the average Catholic is not an expert on the document tradition of marriage and family, these approaches, on one hand, a pastoral approach, a living tradition, and sexual relationships about love and fulfillment, versus, on the other hand, an authoritative approach, an unchanging tradition, and sexual relationships about procreation, permeate the varied ethics of sex in Catholic spaces such as families, parishes, and universities, where sex and gender is practiced and enacted. So while definitely the data, but also the documents themselves can feel very distant, I think that these, and this is sort of what a lot of my research focuses on right now in terms of the ways that both of these cultural realities of sex and gender are operating on queer and LGBTQ students who are sort of coming into understanding their own identity and forming this idea of what exactly and specifically it means to be closeted or to come out of the closet on a college campus in the US. And so, like I said, zooming out and connecting these specific issues of closeted as oppression and violence with sort of the larger struggle of LGBTQ issues and the emergence of the closet as a literary device over time, I'll jump into a brief overview of Eve Sedgwick's work to help us think about the development of queer identity. And so the modern gay liberation movement in the United States dates itself to the 1969 riots at Stonewall Inn. These riots abruptly brought the private sphere of queer and trans life into the public arena in a political way, demanding a right to exist without fear of policing or violence. Accompanying this eruption of marginal sexuality onto the public sphere was the rhetoric of coming out. Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet takes a critical look at the construction of language and the social function of terms like homo and heterosexuality. Sedgwick writes, even the phrase the closet as a publicly intelligible signifier for gay-related epistemological issues is made available only by the difference made by the post-Stonewall gay politics oriented around coming out of the closet. National Coming Out Day was founded in 1988 as a way to celebrate living freely as gay or lesbian, an example of the solidification of the closet into national discourse. Sedgwick's argument is that the idea of the closet and of homosexual identity represented a new form of world mapping into binary categories. The idea of queer visibility that coming out of the closet harkens to has, of course, been a source of queer or a distinct joy for the queer community. Around the world, Pride marches announce the presence of a wide range of sexualities and gender identities, celebrating pride in one's identity over the shame that can accompany the experience of being closeted. There are distinct ways that the celebration of visibility or of being out has served to protect queer people in the legal sphere and in the workplace. In contemporary politics, this gains a renewed sense of relevancy when considering the Don't Say Gay bill signed in March 2022 in Florida, and the history of Don't Ask, Don't Tell politics in the US military. So Sedgwick does not deny the concrete social impacts that the possibility of being outside the closet has had for queer people. However, she writes, there are risks in making salient the continuity and centrality of the closet, and a historical narrative that does not have as its fulcrum a saving vision, whether located in past or future, of its apocalyptic rupture. A meditation that lacks that particular utopian organization will risk glamorizing the closet itself, if only by default, will risk presenting as inevitable or somehow valuable its extractions, its deformations, its disempowerment, and sheer pain. Sedgwick is concerned about the ways that working within an epistemology of the closet limits our imaginations of what is possible for queer flourishing. There's a way that the closet imaginary depends on the idea of certain vulnerable queer bodies, disempowerment, and sheer pain, as she writes. So there's a way that the closet contains a certain degree of violence in its ordering of gender and sexuality into neatly packaged narratives that often operate in simplistic binarisms. For Sedgwick, this is due to an approach to knowledge as stable and sexual categories as therefore easily identifiable. Queer affirmation, on the other hand, often privileges unknowing. The hermeneutic that Sedgwick proposes in this foundational text is described by Gila Ashter, another queer theorist, as the will not to know. If the closet represents a clearly defined and knowable past and a neatly intelligible queer identity of the present and future, then queer epistemology, queer theory generally, resists the idea that there is a completely knowable queer self. Queerness resists anticipating what is and is not queer. This insight from Sedgwick becomes a defining characteristic of the field of queer theory. The term queer exists as a noun, adjective, and a verb. It is distinctive for its embrace of dislodgement and resistance to any real categorical definition. In this way, the category, at least in theory, aims to be in a constant state of self-critique and becoming. So against the stable knowing of the closet, the embrace of unknowing by queer theorists has produced an imagistic theory on temporality, futurity, and an understanding of queer identity that always exists in a state of longing for the unattainable realm of queer liberation. Jose Munoz is a queer theorist who centers his book on queer survival around the image of a horizon. He says, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. Munoz calls for queer people to strive to think and feel a then and there. And this is not a dualistic or an otherworldly framework, but rather a call for attentiveness to queer practices and aesthetics that represent a doing for and toward the future that Munoz elaborates throughout his book. Alison Kafer is another queer theorist who talks about queer, feminist, and crip temporality. Crip being a word reclaimed by the disability community in the same way that queer has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community. And Kafer understands temporality as flex time, not just expanded, but exploded. It requires reimagining our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. Like Munoz, Kafer aims to explode our understanding of temporality and to make contested what often goes unthought due to our assumptions about normative bodies. She suggests that the expansive imaginary around sex, gender, and disability that she proposes can never be fully or finally achieved, but serves as a kind of hopeful horizon. Sedgwick's opening chapter quote for her book is from Marcel Proust's The Captive, where he writes of social lies or narrative myths that one overcomes. That lie is one of the few things in the world that can open windows for us onto what is new and unknown, that can awaken in us sleeping senses for the contemplation of universes that otherwise we should never have known. In my opinion, I think it's very striking how theological queer theorists like Munoz, Kafer, and Sedgwick, here in her opening reflection, can sound when attempting to understand the vulnerability of queer bodies and the violence rendered by certain binaristic rhetorics or literary devices such as the closet. True to Sedgwick's argument, the Proust quote illuminates the beauty of unknowing and its possibility for awakening us via contemplation to a form of imagination or mystical knowing that would previously have gone unattained. So from here, I'll turn to Karl Rahner and his theology and anthropology, which I aim to explore a lot, mostly through his contemplative writings, and show how this can illuminate a theological and a contemplative dimension to how queer theorists are defining flourishing here, and sort of the reclaiming of this idea of mystery and this idea of unknowing that is also in some way very fundamental to contemplative practice generally, and also specifically to Rahner's theology. So moving to Rahner, Rahner employs the notion of horizon in his philosophical reclaimings of Martin Heidegger, but the horizon he has in mind has a lot of resonances with some of those quotes I just read from Munoz and Kafer, I believe. Rahner's interpreter, William Dyke, emphasizes the approach to knowledge in Rahner moving not from without, but from within existence, such that theology is able to be in dialogue with modern philosophical concerns. Rahner adds the theological stakes involved in queer flourishing. When viewed with the insights of the Christian contemplative tradition and his own contemplative writings, Rahner's own ethics for experiencing a graced and mysterious life is apparent. In Grace and Freedom, Rahner meditates on what he names the little word God, and provides some musings on the topic. For Rahner, God is simultaneously evokes the concept of a higher being, and the idea of an entity that's always fundamentally limited, a failure to describe the full image of that to which it refers. This is the dynamic which leads Rahner to describe God as mystery. And he says here, God is the silent mystery, absolute, unconditioned, and incomprehensible. God is the infinitely distant horizon. This horizon continues to exist just as distantly, even when all the understanding and action relating to it have come to a standstill. God is the unconditioned but conditioning ground, the sacred mystery, because of this everlasting incomprehensibility. God for Rahner is both beyond our comprehension and the conditioning ground for how we experience ourselves, our interiority, and the world around us, our exteriority. There is a way for Rahner that we can become attentive to the mystery of God. He writes, God is there, not here or elsewhere, but everywhere in secret, where the ground of all silently confronts us, where we encounter the inescapable situation of responsibility, where we faithfully do our duty without reward, where we realize the blissful meaning of love, where death is accepted in the midst of life, where joy no longer has a name. In all such modes of existence, we are involved in something other than the strictly definable. God infuses the creative world in an active form of presence for Rahner. It is not us that confronts the ground, but the ground of all that silently confronts us. Our situation of response to our Creator is inescapable. It is the most natural thing that we could do. And when we do those hard or joyful activities of embracing life and death, we are fundamentally involved with something incomprehensible. In a sense, we are suddenly made aware of the divine creaturely dynamic that existed and is always in ongoing relationship. Moments of spiritual encounter reveal to us the infinite horizon of God and the long, eternal process of becoming. So I begin with that contemplative understanding of God from Rahner to illuminate the concepts of freedom, mystery, and transcendence that define Rahner's theology of relationship between God and creation. For Rahner, transcendental experience is how we enter in freedom into God's mystery. It is defined as the subjective, unthematic, necessary, and unfailing consciousness of the knowing subject that is co-present in every spiritual act of knowledge, and the subject's openness to the unlimited expanse of all possible reality. It is not merely an experience of knowledge, but also of the will and of freedom. The consciousness of God is that which is beyond the strictly definable, the God that exists prior to the human limitations of language. Rahner's theology begins with the person, the hearer of God's message. Anne Kozee writes, "The experience in which we become conscious of ourselves as selves is one of radical questioning. No single cause, whether biological or cultural, entirely explains us to ourselves. We experience God in the mystery of our daily lives and the questions that it brings, which become the foremost way in which we can understand God for Rahner. It is in opening ourselves to the unlimited horizons of such questioning that we have already transcended or gone beyond ourselves and beyond the limits of any particular question or explanation." This methodological choice to begin with the person and our questions makes freedom central to Rahner's anthropology, as we can choose to move in freedom closer in proximity or further from the horizon of God's mystery. If freedom is a transcendental concept in this sense, then there is always an element of freedom that cannot be made fully conscious or empirically defined. For Rahner, God is simultaneously the one who imparts our freedom and the one who self-communicates to us, to which we have the choice to respond in freedom. In these two movements, Rahner makes possible the asymmetry between God and creation and the nearness of God to ourselves and society. Rahner writes, "God is the abiding and holy mystery as the incomprehensible ground of man's transcendent existence is not only the God of infinite distance, but always wants to be the God of absolute closeness and a true self-communication. And God is present in this way in the spiritual depths of our existence, as well as in the concreteness of our corporeal history. It is this notion of the transcendental freedom that we have to move toward a radically present, yet eternally mysterious God, who we can know more fully through greater response to God's self-communication in our own beings, that is most compellingly concretized by the contemplative tradition and Rahner's own contemplative writings." In Martin Laird's book on the practice of contemplation, he writes often of the role of attentiveness and stillness, accompanied by silence, in becoming attuned to God. Discovering God in contemplative practice is often about becoming aware to that which is already present, the ways in which we already commune with God. Laird speaks of the heart mind, which asks the meditator to shift attention from the screen of thinking mind on which both thoughts and feelings incessantly appear, to the ground of the heart, this immense valley of awareness itself, in which the thoughts and feelings appear. The concentration of attention in the heart, this is the starting point of prayer. And this type of concentration that asks us to be still, to be silent, requires cultivation and practice. It is not easy to enter our deepest selves in a world of pain, suffering, and brokenness. Contemplation may seem like an activity set apart from our daily lives, but for Laird and Rahner, this could not be farther from the truth. Contemplation helps us to engage our lives more deeply. Laird shows this in a consideration of fear, pain, and woundedness at the end of his book. He writes, "The doorway into the silent land is a wound. Silence lays bare this wound. We do not journey far along the spiritual path before we get some sense of the wound of the human condition. And this is precisely why not a few abandon a contemplative practice like meditation as soon as it begins to expose this wound. Contemplation requires that we look squarely at our feelings, including the most feared and negative emotions, and sit below them on a deeper and forever deepening ground. By engaging contemplative practice, Laird tells us that we learn how to be in this wound. When we discover the silent core of this wound, we discover a place of non-condemnation, of silent, loving communion with God, and of compassion for all. We are forever sinful, fallible, wounded beings. In an incarnational interpretation, contemplation places us, as Laird says, where the balm of divinity anoints broken humanity. Bringing Laird's insights to bear on Rahner's anthropology shows how cultivating a contemplative life can help one to live out Rahner's understanding of our free choice to move transcendentally along the infinitely distant horizon of knowing God. Contemplation allows us to encounter God as mystery in our daily lives and to feel ourselves in relation to a creator who knows in ways that are unattainable. We are able to embrace the unknown in prayer as, in fact, a unique form of knowing that is not to be feared. In some way, we become more ourselves. And when the existential ability to integrate spirituality and sexuality is one of the biggest threats to queer existence, exemplified by the perpetually high rates of youth suicide and the negative impact of organized religion in the lives of queer people, this is no small component of queer flourishing. And from here, I'll move to a few prayers that Rahner prays in this small book of his Encounters with Silence. In this book, just as Laird suggests, Rahner's engagement with contemplation is a manner of being in the wound. Throughout the 10 prayers of the book, positioned as communication between Rahner and the various ways that he chooses to name God in relation to himself, there is a sense of the dependence of Rahner on the Creator. In God of my life, Rahner prays, "But if you were not incomprehensible, you would be inferior to me, for my mind could grasp and assimilate you. You would belong to me instead of I to you, and that would truly be hell if I should belong only to myself." This image of God is certainly recognizable from Rahner's Theology. And later in his incarnational prayer, Rahner considers this same idea of the concept and conceptualization of God with the image of an ocean. He says, "You have restrained the ocean of your infinity from flooding in over the poor little wall which protects my tiny life's acre from your vastness. Not the waters of your great sea, but only the dew of your gentleness is to spread itself over my poor little plot of earth." Rahner's prayers more explicitly draw out an ultimate understanding of love, that is at the core of his theological anthropology in his more academic texts. There is a way that this felt form of love is best experienced and articulated contemplatively in prayer and guides our relationships to God, ourselves, and others. For queer people, self-love can become a horizon of discovery that privileges the mysteries we are to ourselves and diminishes the relevance of the closet binary. Love runs in the background through Rahner's foundations, but as I mentioned, it's a central concept in many of the prayers in this book. In God of My Life, Rahner emphasizes the incomprehensible mystery that God is to us, and this is reflected here. Only in love can I find you, my God. In love, the gates of my soul spring open. Allow me to breathe a new air of freedom and forget my own petty self. In love, my whole being streams forth out of the rigid confines of narrowness and anxious self-assertion. By entering into love, Rahner experiences the freedom that he writes of, transcending the narrow elements of his cognition and unifying with that which is mystery. There is a felt experience of joy in this prayerful unity. He writes, in this state of joy, my mind no longer tries to bring you forcibly down to its level in order to wrest you from your eternal secret, but rather love seizes me and carries me up to your level into you. Rather than the seeking of the human mind, entering joy allows Rahner to be found and seized by the love of the divine. Love is also present in Rahner's prayer, God of Knowledge. Here, Rahner emphasized the limits of traditional understandings of knowledge, very similar to our queer theorists, saying, it seems to me that knowing touches only the surface of things, that it fails to penetrate to the heart, to the depths of my being where I am most truly I. While knowledge is limited, love is transcendent. Rahner asks, how can we approach the heart of all things, the true heart of reality? Not by knowledge alone, but by the full flower of knowledge that is love. In this prayer, Rahner is limited in his own knowledge of his experiences of the world and of suffering. He relies not on his own ability to understand, but rather on loving a God who enlightens on an incomprehensible horizon. While one day Rahner will experience the unity with the divine that will allow him full comprehension, he prays for the consolation of God and the stillness of his yearning heart. As you yourself are my knowledge, as Rahner prays, the knowledge that is light and life. You yourself are my knowledge, experience, and love. You are the God of the one and only knowledge that is eternal, the knowledge that is bliss without end. In the prayers of Rahner, love seems to be a crucial component of the deepest ground of his being that constitutes the fundamental articulations of mystery and transcendence. Both love and response to love allow Rahner to contemplate the core theological categories of his anthropology. This love for Rahner is infused throughout all things and represents a horizon, a constant state of becoming. In God of My Daily Routine, Rahner writes practically from a sense of cultivating awareness to divine mystery around the mundane activities of daily life. Rahner contemplates if it is best to spend life cloistered or in constant prayer, but concludes that even in these sacred settings, it is always possible to lose sight of the divine amongst daily practices. Leaving his ordinary life behind would accomplish nothing at all. But Rahner concludes, if it's true that I can lose you in everything, it must also be true that I can find you in everything. If you have given me no single place to which I can flee and be sure of finding you, if anything I do can mean the loss of you, then I must be able to find you in every place, in each and everything I do. Thus I must seek you in all things. If every day is every day, then every day is your day, and every hour is the hour of your grace. Rahner's theology is one of attentiveness to the grace offered to us around us at each moment of being alive. Worldly contemplation can lead us to encounters with the divine, even in the most mundane moments of our daily routine. God is incomprehensible mystery infused through all of creation, an emphasis on the nearness of the creator to the created. Rahner's understanding of the divine that is both radically exterior to creation and radically interior to our own lived experiences and practice here in his contemplative prayers serves to allow the created to feel the potential for divine mystery and grace to be experienced at any moment. Rahner concludes, "In your love, all the diffusion of the day's chores come home again to the evening of your unity, which is eternal life. This love, which can allow my daily routine to remain routine and still transform it into a homecoming to you, this love only you can give." Once again, Rahner turns to the divine love to which we respond in freedom and love of our own. Even the mundane chores of the day are a part of our homecoming to eternal life. Cultivating contemplative awareness allows us to experience transcendence and mystery in the world in a very distinct way. And in a last prayer, Rahner ends Encounters with Silence with an Advent prayer, a contemplation on the God who is to come. He muses on the annual liturgy each year of entering into a state of patience and waiting for the coming of a God who has, in a sense, already come. But is it so that God has really already come? Rahner prays, "Are you the eternal Advent? Are you he who is always still to come, but never arrives in such a way as to fulfill our expectations? In this way, what does it mean to be a people in wait?" Rahner evokes his image of the horizon. Are you only the distant horizon surrounding the world of our deeds and sufferings, the horizon which, no matter where we roam, is always just as far away? Rahner prays with the tension between the desire and longing for the coming of God's nearness, and yet the incomprehensibility that always puts God at a distance on the horizon. Rahner's anthropology in this prayer creates a situation of existential agony, perhaps. Rahner ends with an insight about God's perpetual coming. Slowly, a light is beginning to dawn. I'm beginning to understand something I have known for a long time. You are still in the process of your coming. Your appearance in the form of a slave was only the beginning of your coming. Actually, you haven't come. You're still coming. Behold, you come. And your coming is neither past nor future, but the present, which has only to reach its fulfillment. Now it is still the one single hour of your advent. The agony becomes peace as Rahner considers incarnation in perpetuity, a process that comes to bear on the present, the radical now, as much as the historical event that we celebrate in Advent liturgy. Christ, the ultimate microcosm for Christian anthropology, exists in a constant process of discovery and becoming. In this way, Christ becomes near to all of us, but also in particular near to the queer experience of becoming. So all of this, starting with the beginning of the ways in which the closet can create situations of contemporary violence for queer people, moving to the way that this has been theorized and bringing it into conversation with the way that contemplative thinkers such as Rahner himself and his prayers, but also his anthropology that emphasizes grace and mystery, serve to destabilize the idea of the closet and the stability or the finality of queer identity that this dynamic presumes. Rahner contests the human ability to attain full knowledge, putting God always on the horizon of our beings in a way strikingly similar to how queer theorists want to also think about queer identity formation. His contemplative application of his theology in the prayers and encounters with silence allows us to consider contemplative practice as flourishing in the lives of queer people. And I think that this is concretely important for a few reasons here. Firstly, moving beyond the closet and toward the idea of a horizon of knowing God, self, and sexuality through spiritual practice eliminates the need for a queer person to know exactly what identity they're coming out as. Labels can be very helpful until they are not, and understanding that identity can be fluid and changing over time relieves anxiety and allows oneself to be in a process of love and discovery. Secondly, this approach in practice removes the idea of success from full queer visibility. The closet can create an unfair ethical demand on queer people to be out to family, friends, and loved ones, seemingly all at once. And life can be seen as a journey, and the success is to be found in relating oneself in love to God, self, and others in a multitude of changing ways. I think this is especially important in areas around the world where queerness and violence are more distinctly related. And thirdly, and most importantly, I think queer freedom and flourishing is redefined away from the closet in a way that imparts agency to the queer person. There is an integration between the spiritual life and the knowledge or reflection on sexual identity and desires in a way in which theology becomes helpful rather than a source of trauma. For queer people who are part of a faith tradition, this is a powerful way where religion can be reframed and reclaimed. And like I said, I want to end this section on queer becoming in a bit of a practical way, and thinking about how to do this in practice, either with ourselves or in ministry with LGBTQ people. And for that, in that sense, I want to end with this poem from Mary Oliver. I think that it's possible that quite a few of us in this room are familiar with Mary Oliver. I think something I like to highlight in my ministry is just the fact that she was an out lesbian woman who existed in a 40-year marriage to her wife. And of course, this influences the poetry that she writes. And although much known for her nature imagery, many of her poems also have this distinctly integrative feel between her own sexual experiences and attentiveness to that, in addition to attentiveness to the created world around her. I very much think that what Mary Oliver is doing in this very, very famous poem, Wild Geese, is exactly what our queer theorists and Karl Rahner is sort of getting at in terms of thinking about becoming as an element of being deeply attentive to our interior calls around us, our interior desires, perhaps letting go of what needs to be let go, in a very contemplative sense, thinking imaginatively about new worlds and creating new worlds of belonging. So I'll end by taking us through this poem. I will read the poem twice. The first time I invite you to just experience the poem, pay attention to what words strike you. If you've read or heard this poem before, what is sticking out to you now? And then in the second reading of the poem, I invite you either to consider some of the reflection questions I've offered here, or to sit more deeply and go more deeply with the images that stuck with you the first time. After that, I'll give a brief space of silence, and then I'll end us after that. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. So thank you so much to you all for your attentiveness during this presentation, and I look forward to our conversation and hearing what insights may have come up from our contemplative moment, or just conversation more generally about any of the themes.
Thank you so much, Barb. That was amazing. Really grateful for everything you gave us to sit with, especially that reflection at the end. One of my favorite poems by Mary Oliver. I want to open it up we have a little bit of time for some questions and some comments. So folks can use the hand raising function on Zoom or can put questions in the chat. But while those are coming up, I have a question, just kind of a more general question that I've been thinking about, which is, I think there's a common misconception, especially among undergraduate students. This was an experience I had about the contemplative life or bringing contemplative practice to one's own kind of day-to-day routine, is that it's inactive or somehow not connected to advocacy and activism, which is really important to people in that age group. But I am wondering if you can say more about the strengths of the contemplative life for people in that particular age group, which I think you suggested in the presentation. And then do you have suggestions for how to bring that to the lives of people who are really interested in engaging activism? Because I do see a disconnect between people's perception of contemplation and activism. Whereas Rahner's theology is very clear that there's a connection there. So I'm curious if you could kind of draw that thread for us.
Yes, definitely. I think, and I failed to mention this at the beginning, but I come from a campus ministry background, and a lot of the kind of my own entry into kind of having this emphasis on contemplation or spirituality in my own research has come from some of the work that I've done in those settings. And I very much resonate, Olivia, with what you just shared around kind of different like student personalities on campus. Like I was kind of beginning with, I think that there are a lot of sort of like some unique, some, you know, trends that I have pointed out that have been kind of existing for a certain amount of time now. But I think on many of the Jesuit university campuses on which I've ministered, I encounter like a few different like student personas, but I would say definitely a dominant one being like very interested in social justice and very connected to the Catholic Church's emphasis on like Catholic social teaching, and maybe like a sort of like spiritual but not religious type of mindset, where like some of the more what we might call like prayerful or contemplative or liturgical elements of what we might consider to be a religious person kind of being like set aside or even observed with some skepticism. And I think especially in my own experience, like especially with the queer community, when some of that type of engagement, and maybe specifically around like biblical texts or what have you, has sort of even been weaponized against you in a way that something like prayer or contemplation might just have like aspects of like harm or violence, or even trauma associated with those things for some of our modern students that we're experiencing or like are on our campuses. And I think that all of that I think just requires a lot of like pastoral attention from campus ministers today. And I know that there are so many campus ministers doing like such great work around this, but I do find like poetry as well as like people who are sort of like people like Mary Oliver, who you can point to as like people who are out as LGBTQ. I think of Andrea Gibson as another poet I would put into this category, or in like a in a Catholic sense, you know, of course, someone like Brian Massengill, I think like is kind of exemplifies like what it can mean to be a Catholic and to like incorporate or integrate prayer and spirituality into that life. But this is such a long answer to that question, but I think it's a really great question. And I just think it requires a lot of pastoral care, a lot of pastoral attention. And I think with different groups of students, there are different needs, but being sensitive to those like harm points, I think is really important.
Thank you so much. That was a really great answer. I think I asked the question because in my own experience in undergrad, I was kind of surrounded by people who really rejected this contemplative piece for a lot of the reasons you said. But I also saw its value. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I see a couple hands, so we'll start with Kathy.
I just want to add to what you just said, Barb. I just did a land justice. There was a webinar sponsored by the old Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Futures. And so coming into the space, and it was virtual, they had some very soft chant going, and there were 22 in the end, 22 women, all of us pretty, older. But what we did in that hour was to write letters to the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, a letter to Leonard Peltier. This had to do with Leonard Peltier receiving parole. But what we all remarked about at the end is that we were given a space to be an activist, and none of us felt that we were really activists. We were probably all more contemplatives than anything else. But to provide a physical space that is soothing right when you walk in, And even though you have very important things to do, writing these letters or sending emails and all the addresses, everything was there for us. That allowed us to be activists in a contemplative space.
Yes.
And I had never experienced that before. So I just put it out, to people.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for tonight. It was wonderful.
Thank you for that comment. And I think that connects very well with what Olivia was just saying, and kind of like pulling toward this idea of the way that like contemplative life and being like active political community are things that are deeply related. And I didn't get to talk so much about this, but I think also like it is so very clear how Rahner is, so formed by Ignatian spirituality. And I think that just like that Ignatian kind of emphasis on contemplation and action, or this sort of like pastoral cycle between like, we can't always be doing things. Sometimes we have to like take a step back and be reflecting and kind of working on our interiority, and seeing all of that as like an integrated part of what it means to be human. I think is something that I take away largely from the Jesuits, and yeah, just our Catholic spirituality generally. So yes, thank you.
Great. And then Daryl, I see your hand. You want to jump in?
Yeah, yes, thank you. Thank you. Hey, Barb, that was excellent. Thanks for that presentation. And as you were talking, I was just kind of struck by, especially when you had the reference to the God of Advent and the God who is to come.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by not only have we constructed a closet for other human beings, but we've also done the same for God.
Mm-hmm.
And God is in that closet as opposed to the beautiful image of the horizon
Mm-hmm.
that you described. But my question is, so how did you, though, come to utilize Karl Rahner's theology in the context of the queer becoming? Because it's pretty profound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I was sort of ending the previous comment on, I think I sort of come to it through like, in a convoluted sense, just like through my own experience with like Jesuit universities, Jesuit ministry, Ignatian spirituality. Like that sort of like pastoral background was like really important for me prior to encountering Rahner in a very academic sense of I've encountered Rahner in my like master's degree classrooms and in my PhD classrooms. But like as I read Rahner, which I'm sure others who have perhaps read Rahner before can relate to, it's just like, and it's so poetic, it is so spiritual, and really like that idea of the horizon just immediately brought me back to like Jose Munoz in particular, I will say, of the queer theorist, who talks about queerness as a horizon imbued with potentiality, which I think is just were very healing words for me to hear when I was first encountering queer theory and first kind of like coming to integrate my own like what Catholic spirituality meant for me as a queer person. And so I think kind of like I think there's important ways that we have to name that there's limits to the way that we can bring queer theory and Catholic theology together. But I also think it's very, very powerful to name the overlaps and the ways in which these queer theorists are naming something that is so deeply similar to what Rahner is naming. So yeah, that's a little bit of an answer. And thank you so much for being here, Daryl. It's great to see you.
I think we'll wrap up here. Barb, thank you so very much for this presentation. It was very deep and it was very rich. And someone here in the chat, which I know you weren't paying close attention to because you were presenting, mentioned how great it was to be re-exposed to the writing and thinking of Karl Rahner. And I felt that as you were presenting too. And one of the gifts that I think your way of approaching this for the whole church, and I think Daryl spoke about this a little bit too, is that it offers a pathway for all of us, and not just queer people, but I think that is one of the gifts that the queer community is bringing to the church. Whether you're considering your vocation, whether you're considering your avocation, just whether you're considering who you are, like none of that needs to be set in stone today.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain liberation in that. So thank you for drawing that out and teasing it. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Russ. Yeah.